there is an object that has never been found. No tomb holds it. No museum displays it behind glass. No expedition has returned with it, triumphant, brushing centuries of dust from its surface. And yet, for nearly 1,000 years, it has been the most searched for treasure in all of human history. Men have crossed continents for it. Kings have sent armies. Monks have prayed their entire lives in its direction. Poets have written of it in language so beautiful that even those who read it centuries later feel something stir in their chest they cannot quite name. It is the Holy Grail. And what makes it so extraordinary is not merely that it has never been found, but that no one can even agree on exactly what it is. Some say it was the cup, the very cup that Jesus of Nazareth raised at the Last Supper, the final meal shared with his 12 disciples, before the events that would change the course of Western civilization forever. A simple vessel, perhaps clay, perhaps wood, perhaps hammered metal, passed quietly from hand to hand around a table in Jerusalem, holding wine that those present believed in that moment to be sacred beyond all reckoning. A cup, then, that the world would spend the next 2,000 years trying to find. Others say it was the vessel used by Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy follower of Jesus, a man of quiet courage who claimed the body from the cross to collect the blood of the crucifixion, a vessel that held not wine, but something far more charged with meaning. That this object, stained with the most significant blood in the Christian world, was then carried westward, out of the Middle East, through Europe, toward the green and misty islands at the edge of the known world, that it was hidden, and that it waits there still. Still others, and this is where the story grows wonderfully strange, say that the Grail was never a cup at all, that it was a stone, fallen from heaven, or a dish, or a book containing secrets so powerful that their very existence would unravel the comfortable certainties of the world we think we know. And there are those, scholars, quiet and careful, who suggest the Grail is something more interior than any of these, that it was always a symbol, a metaphor for the soul's deepest longing, for the divine that lives just beyond the reach of human hands, close enough to feel, too sacred to hold. All of these things. None of these things. Perhaps all of them at once. This is the nature of the Grail. It shifts, it breathes, it means something slightly different to every age that reaches for it, and that, more than any relic or artifact, may be the secret of its enduring power. The legend, as most of us know it, comes draped in the armor of Arthurian romance. In the great medieval tales, the ones told by firelight in the halls of European castles, the ones committed to manuscript by monks and troubadours with extraordinary care, the Grail appears as the central object of the most noble quest imaginable. King Arthur, seated at his famous round table with the finest knights of his age, receives a vision. The Grail appears before them in a blaze of light, carried by unseen hands, filling the hall with a fragrance that each knight later says reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten. And then, before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. It is gone, and from that moment everything changes. The knights ride out, not together, separately, each alone, into a forest that medieval writers describe with deliberate care as thick, dark, and without a path. Because the quest for the Grail, the storytellers understood, was not a journey that could be made in formation. It was a journey that each person had to make in their own direction, into their own particular darkness, with no guarantee of return. Some would find castles. Some would find temptation. Some would find themselves tested in ways they never anticipated, forced to ask questions that had no comfortable answers, forced to sit with uncertainty longer than any of them had planned. Very few would find the Grail, and those who did in the most resonant versions of the story, found something unexpected waiting for them. Not a trophy, not a reward in any conventional sense, but a question. A single, simple question they had been too afraid, or too proud, or simply too hurried to ask. This is a documentary about that question, about the object, yes, its origins, its symbolism, the historical threads that wind through 2 millennia of faith and folklore, but also about the quest itself, about why human beings, across so many centuries and so many cultures, have felt the pull of something they cannot name, something that promises to make whole what feels broken, to make meaningful what feels random, to offer, in the words of one medieval poet, that which the heart has always wanted, without knowing what to call it. We are going to take our time with this, because the Grail, if it teaches us anything, is that rushing has never served the seeker. Settle in. We begin at the beginning, or as close to it as history will allow us to go. Every legend has a seed, a single moment, or a single person, from which everything else grows outward like rings in still water. For the Holy Grail, that seed is planted, not in the courts of Camelot, not in the libraries of medieval France, not even in the misty hills of Britain, where so much of the legend would eventually take root, but in a city of pale stone and long memory, in the 1st century of the Common Era, at the intersection of Roman imperial power and one of the most consequential religious movements the world has ever known. The city is Jerusalem. The year, by most scholarly reckoning, is somewhere around 30 CE, and the story begins, as so many of history's great stories do, not with kings or generals, but with a meal. The Last Supper is one of the most painted moments in human history. Leonardo da Vinci gave us the version most of us carry in our minds. That long table, that warm light, those 13 figures arranged in a composition so deliberately balanced, it feels almost architectural. But strip away the centuries of artistic interpretation, and what remains is something quieter and more intimate. A group of men gathered in an upper room in Jerusalem, sharing bread and wine on the eve of a festival, aware, some of them, at least, that something was ending, that the world as they had known it for the past 3 years was about to fracture. At the center of this gathering is Jesus of Nazareth, and at some point during this meal, according to the gospel accounts, he takes a cup filled with wine, and he passes it. He speaks words over it that his followers will spend the next 2 millennia turning over in their minds, meditating on, building entire theologies around. This is my blood, he says, poured out for many. A cup, passed around a table, in a room in Jerusalem that no longer exists. This is where the Grail story begins, or where it might begin, because here, at the very foundation of the legend, we encounter the first of many fascinating uncertainties. The Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, describe the Last Supper in some detail, but none of them say anything about the cup afterward. None of them tell us what became of it. No disciple picks it up as a keepsake. No early Christian text describes it being preserved or venerated. It simply disappears from the written record as completely and quietly, as if it had never existed at all. And into that silence, centuries later, imagination and longing would pour everything. The first true architect of the Grail legend is not a theologian. He is not a historian. He is, in fact, a figure who is himself semi-legendary, existing at the precise border between history and devotion, where so many of the most fascinating people in the ancient world seem to live. His name is Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph appears in all 4 Gospels briefly, at a moment of extraordinary courage, after the crucifixion, when the disciples have scattered and the danger of association with the executed preacher is very real. It is Joseph, described as a wealthy member of the Jewish council and a secret follower of Jesus, who goes to Pontius Pilate and asks for the body. This was not a small thing to ask. This was a public act, a declaration, a man of standing stepping forward at the worst possible moment and saying quietly and firmly that this mattered to him. Pilate grants the request. Joseph takes the body, wraps it in linen, and places it in his own tomb. A tomb that had never been used, carved from rock, sealed with a great stone. And then, in the Gospels, Joseph of Arimathea exits the story as quickly as he entered it. 4 brief appearances across 4 texts, and then nothing. But legend, restless, imaginative, always reaching for more, was not satisfied with nothing. By the time we reach the early medieval period, a rich body of tradition has grown up around Joseph that the Gospels themselves never hint at. He becomes, in these later accounts, the guardian of the cup from the Last Supper. Some versions say he used it to collect blood from the wounds of Christ during the crucifixion or afterward, an act that transforms the object from a simple drinking vessel into something charged with the most sacred substance imaginable. And then, these legends tell us, he kept it. He carried it with him through imprisonment, for he was said to have been imprisoned for years after the crucifixion, sustained miraculously by the Grail's presence, and eventually, when he was released, he traveled westward, always westward. This westward journey of Joseph of Arimathea is one of the great mythological migrations in all of Western storytelling. Different versions sent him to different places, to France, to the south of England, to the strange and ancient landscape of Somerset, where the flat marshlands and the strange conical hill of Glastonbury Tor rise out of the mist like something from a half-remembered dream. According to the most enduring English version of the legend, it is here that Joseph plants his staff in the ground, and it blooms, the famous Glastonbury thorn, a hawthorn tree that by tradition flowers twice a year, once in spring and once, miraculously, at Christmas, and which pilgrims visited for centuries as physical proof of the story's truth. And here, in this green and ancient corner of England, Joseph is said to have built the first Christian church on British soil. And here, in some version of the story, he is said to have hidden the Grail, buried it, or sealed it in a well, or entrusted it to a lineage of guardians who would carry the secret forward through the centuries, waiting for the moment when the right seeker would finally arrive and ask the right question. The well still exists, at the foot of Glastonbury Tor, surrounded now by a garden kept with quiet care. The chalice well runs red with water rich in iron oxide, a color that has never failed to stir something in those who come to see it. It has run continuously for thousands of years. People still come to it, still cup their hands and drink, still feel, in the presence of that particular combination of water and stone and story, something they struggle afterward to describe. Now, a careful historian must pause here. And it is worth pausing, because one of the most rewarding things about the Grail legend is that the line between history and myth is not a wall. It is more like a shoreline. The tide moves. What is submerged in one era becomes visible in another. The Joseph of Arimathea traditions, scholars tell us, appear to have developed primarily between the 10th and 12th centuries after the events they describe. The earliest texts associating Joseph specifically with a sacred vessel and a journey to Britain date from the 11th and 12th centuries at the earliest. Glastonbury Abbey, which was famously damaged by fire in 1184, had very strong institutional motivations to develop and promote its association with Joseph, with the Grail, and, as we shall see in a later segment, with King Arthur himself. The abbey needed pilgrims. It needed prestige. And in the medieval world, there was no more potent source of prestige than a relic, or better still, the promise of one. This does not, it should be said, make the legend less interesting. If anything, it makes it more so, because what it reveals is a culture in active conversation with its own longings. A medieval world that was, in a very real and human sense, deciding what it needed to believe, and then building the stories that would allow it to believe it. The Grail legends were not deceptions. They were expressions. They were the medieval imagination reaching with genuine yearning towards something it felt was real, even when it could not prove it was true. There is something in that worth sitting with, because the impulse that caused a 12th century monk at Glastonbury to look at his landscape, the red-stained well, the ancient hill, the stories the local people had been telling for generations, and to say something sacred happened here, something was brought here, something waits here still. That impulse is not so different from the one that sends people to that same well today. Standing in that garden, listening to the water, feeling the particular quality of the silence, the desire to believe that the world is not merely mechanical, that beneath the ordinary surface of things, beneath the stones and the water and the grass and the sky, there is something holy, moving slowly, patient as geology, waiting to be found by whoever comes with a quiet enough mind to find it. That desire is the true seed of the Grail legend. Everything else, the cup, the blood, the journey westward, the hidden guardian, the flowering staff, is the flower that grew from it. And in our next segment, we will watch that flower open fully, as the legend passes from the hands of monks and pilgrims into the hands of the poets, and becomes, in their telling, one of the most beautiful and enduring stories Western civilization has ever told itself. There is a moment in the life of every great story when it escapes, when it slips free of the hands that first held it. The theologians, the monks, the careful keepers of sacred tradition, and finds its way into the open air, into the marketplaces and the great halls and the firelit evenings where ordinary people gather to listen, when it stops being doctrine and becomes something wilder and more democratic, something that belongs, suddenly, to everyone. For the Holy Grail, that moment of escape happens in the latter half of the 12th century, and the door through which it passes is opened by a single man, a French poet working in the court of a noblewoman in Champagne, writing in a language and a style that was, at that precise moment in history, the most fashionable and alive form of literary expression in the Western world. His name was Chrétien de Troyes, and what he did with the Grail, almost certainly without fully understanding what he was setting in motion, would echo for 800 years. To understand Chrétien, you have to understand the world he was writing in. The late 12th century in France and England, and the courts of Western Europe, was a world in love with a particular kind of story. The chanson de geste, the song of heroic deeds, had given way to something newer, something more interior and more psychologically curious. The romance. Not romance in the modern sense of candlelight and declaration, but romance in its original meaning. A story told in the vernacular tongue, the language of the people rather than the Latin of the church, centered on a hero whose journey was as much inward as outward, a hero who did not simply conquer enemies, but was himself changed, tested, refined, sometimes broken, by the road he traveled. Into this literary moment stepped the legend of King Arthur. The Welsh and Breton traditions had been carrying Arthur's story for generations. The warrior king, the defender of Britain, the leader who fell at the last, and was carried away to some western isle to sleep until his country needed him again. But it was Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, written around 1138, that gave Arthur to the wider European world, and it was the French poets, Chrétien foremost among them, who took that raw material and built from it something of extraordinary elegance and complexity. The Round Table, the Code of Chivalry, the love of Lancelot and Guinevere, the court of Camelot as a kind of golden age, perfect and therefore doomed. These are largely French inventions or French refinements of older Celtic materials. and they are the frame into which the Grail, when it arrives, fits so naturally that it seems almost inevitable. Chrétien's Grail story is called Percival, or The Story of the Grail, and it was written sometime around 1190. It is, by any measure, one of the strangest and most fascinating works of medieval literature, not least because Chrétien never finished it. He died, or stopped, or set it aside for reasons history has not preserved, leaving the story suspended at a moment of such exquisite tension that later writers would spend the next century rushing to complete it, each offering their own resolution, each finding something slightly different at the end of the road. The hero of Chrétien's telling is Percival, a young man raised in the deep forest by a mother who kept him deliberately ignorant of knighthood, of courts, of the entire world of chivalric civilization, because she had lost her husband and her older sons to the violence of that world and wanted to protect what remained. But Percival encounters knights one day in the forest and is so overwhelmed by their gleaming presence that nothing his mother says can hold him. He rides toward the world, toward Arthur's court, toward the great story that is waiting for him, whether he is ready for it or not. He is, for much of the poem, not ready for it. And that unreadiness, that gap between what Percival is and what the moment requires of him, is the engine of the entire narrative, because when the crucial moment arrives, Percival fails it, not through cowardice or wickedness, but through something more achingly human than either of those. He fails it through excessive politeness, through a misapplied lesson about not asking too many questions, through the particular kind of paralysis that comes from trying so hard to do the right thing that you end up doing nothing at all. The scene is the Grail Castle, the Château de Grail, a mysterious palace that appears to Percival as he wanders, guided by what seems like providence, through an emptying landscape. He is received with extraordinary hospitality. He is given a sword, and then, as he sits with his enigmatic host, a man who is wounded, who moves with difficulty, who sits in a posture of patient suffering, a procession passes through the hall. First, a young man carrying a white lance from the tip of which a single drop of blood falls continuously. Then two more figures bearing candelabras. And finally, a beautiful young woman carrying in both hands an object that fills the entire hall with a light so intense it makes the candles around it irrelevant. This is the Grail. In Chrétien's original telling, it is described simply as un graal, a grail, with the indefinite article, suggesting a type of wide-serving dish rather than a singular sacred object. It is decorated with gems. It glows with its own light, and as Percival watches, transfixed, this procession passes not once but several times through the hall, each time the Grail carried past him, each time that extraordinary light flooding the room, and Percival says nothing, asks nothing. He has been taught that a well-bred knight does not pepper his host with questions, and so he sits on his good manners and lets the moment pass. He goes to bed. He wakes in the morning. The castle is silent. The servants are gone. His horse is saddled at the door, and as he rides across the drawbridge, it rises behind him with a speed that almost catches his horse's hooves, and the castle disappears. Later, a woman on the road will tell him what he failed to do. The wounded king, the fisher king, she calls him, a man who can only sit by a river and fish because his wound will not permit him to do more, would have been healed if Percival had simply asked the question, a single question. The simplest question of all, really, and the most profound. Whom does the Grail serve? Or in some versions of the telling, what ails thee? The whole architecture of the legend rests on this one unasked question, on the gap between seeing and understanding, on the paralysis of the well-intentioned, and on the extraordinary idea that the healing of a wounded king, and by extension the healing of a wounded land, for the fisher king's suffering is mirrored in the barrenness of the kingdom around him, depends not on strength or courage or the performance of great deeds, but on simple, compassionate attention, on being present enough and humble enough and caring enough to look at another person's suffering and ask, plainly and without embarrassment, "Are you all right? What is wrong? How can I help?" That is what the Grail demands. And it is, when you sit with it, a quietly radical idea. After Chrétien's unfinished poem, the Grail entered a period of extraordinary literary proliferation. The story called out to be completed, to be explained, to be elaborated, and the poets of the late 12th and early 13th centuries answered that call with remarkable energy. Robert de Boron, writing around 1200, was the first to fuse the Grail story explicitly with the Christian narrative of Joseph of Arimathea, pulling together the threads we explored in our last segment and weaving them into the Arthurian tapestry for the first time. In his telling, the Grail becomes unambiguously the cup of the Last Supper, carried westward by Joseph, and its lineage of guardians stretches in an unbroken line from Jerusalem to Britain. He gave the legend its theological backbone, its sense of sacred history. Then came Wolfram von Eschenbach, a German knight and poet working in the early 13th century, whose version, Parzival, is perhaps the richest and strangest and most psychologically alive of all the Grail texts. Wolfram's Grail is not a cup at all, but a stone. Lapis exilis, he calls it, a phrase that has puzzled scholars for centuries. Fallen from heaven, tended by a brotherhood of knights called the Templeisen, in a castle called Monsalvage. His Parzival is a more fully realized figure than Chrétien's Percival, a man whose journey toward the Grail is explicitly a journey toward maturity, toward the integration of courage and compassion, toward becoming, in the fullest sense, a complete human being. And then the great French prose cycles of the 13th century gathered all of these threads. Chrétien, Robert de Boron, Wolfram, dozens of smaller texts, and wove them into the vast tapestry of the Lancelot Grail, sometimes called the Vulgate cycle, which gave the legend something close to its definitive shape. Here, for the first time, the Grail quest becomes a spiritual test for the entire Round Table. Here, the tragic beauty of the Arthurian world is fully articulated, the understanding that the perfection of Camelot contained, from the very beginning, the seeds of its own undoing. It is a melancholy and magnificent idea that the most beautiful things are also, in some essential way, the most fragile, that the very qualities that make something worth seeking, its purity, its luminosity, its resistance to compromise, are the same qualities that place it forever just beyond reach. The poets understood something that the theologians, with all their precision, sometimes missed, that the Grail was not merely an answer. It was the question that made you worthy of one. There is a king who cannot stand. He sits at the edge of a river with a fishing line in the water, and he fishes. Not because he wants to, not because the catch sustains him in any ordinary way, but because it is the only thing his wound will allow. He cannot ride. He cannot walk the length of his own hall without assistance. He cannot govern, or hunt, or go to war, or do any of the things that medieval kingship demanded of a man in his position. He can only sit and wait and fish in a river that runs through a kingdom that is, like him, slowly dying. The land around him is called the wasteland. The crops do not grow. The rivers run thin or dry entirely. The village is empty. The roads fill with the kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like abandonment. Animals disappear from the forests. Children stop being born or do not survive long enough to matter. The whole landscape wears the Fisher King's wound like a shared illness, as if the suffering of the man at the center of things has radiated outward through the soil and the water and the air, until everything within reach of his kingdom has been touched by the same slow, patient devastation. This is one of the most haunting images in all of Western literature. And it is worth asking, very slowly and very carefully, what it is actually about. Because the Fisher King and his wasteland are not simply dramatic backdrop, they are the deepest layer of the Grail legend. The layer beneath the chivalry and the questing and the gleaming processions through candlelit halls. They are the question the legend is truly asking, dressed in the language of symbol and myth. Because some questions are too large and too old to be asked directly. Who is the Fisher King? In the various tellings, he goes by different names. Anfortas in Wolfram's Parzival, Pelem or Peles in the English traditions, the rich fisher in Chrétien's original. His wound varies in its nature and location depending on the text, but certain elements remain consistent with an almost ritualistic precision. The wound is in the thigh, or sometimes described with a delicacy that makes clear it is something more intimate and more fundamental than a thigh wound. It was received in battle. It will not heal. And it will not heal, not because medicine is unavailable, or because the wound is simply too severe, but because the healing requires something other than medicine. It requires a specific act, from a specific person, at a specific moment of readiness. It requires, in short, to be asked about, to be witnessed, to have someone arrive at last who is paying enough attention and who cares enough to simply say, "What happened to you? How long have you suffered? What do you need?" The Fisher King has been waiting, in some versions of the story, for a very long time. Not years, generations, waiting in that chair by the river, patient with the terrible patience of someone who has no other choice, for a night pure enough and perceptive enough and compassionate enough to arrive and ask. And in the waiting, everything around him has paid the price. The connection between the king and the land, the idea that the health of the ruler and the health of the kingdom are not merely linked but identical, that they share a single pulse, is one of the oldest ideas in human culture. It predates Christianity by millennia. It runs through the sacred kingship traditions of ancient Egypt, through the Celtic myths of Ireland and Wales, through the ritual practices of cultures so old their names have been lost. The king is not simply a political figure. He is a living symbol of the land's vitality. When he flourishes, the crops grow. When he is wounded, the earth itself bleeds. When he dies without a proper successor, the rains stop and the soil goes gray, and the people begin to understand, in a wordless and bone-deep way, that something essential has gone wrong at the center of things. The medieval poets who shaped the Grail legend inherited this idea from the Celtic traditions that lay just beneath the surface of their Christian framework. Traditions carried in the oral literature of Wales and Brittany, in the stories the Breton storytellers brought across the Channel and sold to French courts hungry for the next remarkable tale. They may not have fully understood the ancient roots of what they were working with, but they felt its truth. They recognized, with the instinct that great artists always seem to possess, that this image, the wounded king, the waiting land, the question that would heal them both, reached something in the human listener that more straightforwardly religious imagery could not quite touch. Wolfram von Eschenbach's treatment of the Fisher King is the most fully realized and the most emotionally devastating of all the medieval versions. And it is worth dwelling on it for a moment, because Wolfram does something remarkable. He gives the wound a cause. In Parzival, the Fisher King Anfortas received his wound because of pride. Not pride in the simple cartoonish sense of vanity or arrogance, but something more nuanced and more recognizable. The pride of a young man who believed that his own desire and his own will was sufficient justification for any action. He rode out in pursuit of a love that was not sanctioned by the Grail's purposes. He inscribed a lady's name on his lance, and rode in her service rather than in the service of something larger than himself. And he was struck down. The wound in Wolfram's telling is not punishment in any crude or transactional sense. It is consequence. It is what happens when a person who has been given extraordinary gifts and extraordinary responsibilities turns those gifts inward, uses them for his own satisfaction rather than for the larger good he was entrusted to serve. The wound is the gap between what Anfortas was capable of being and what he chose, in that moment of self-indulgence, to be instead, and the land suffers because the land is always downstream of the choices made at the center. This is Wolfram's great insight, and it is one that carries a weight that has not diminished in 8 centuries of reading. The private failures of powerful people are never truly private. They ripple outward. They change the temperature of the air around them. They make the soil less generous, the rivers less generous, the future less generous than it might otherwise have been. The wasteland is not a metaphor in the distant literary sense. It is a description of something real, something that any person who has lived inside a community shaped by the wounds of those at its center will recognize with an immediacy that needs no explanation. And then there is the question itself. That single, simple, world-changing question. What ails thee? It seems almost too small. When Percival, or Parzival, or whatever name the hero carries in a given telling, finally returns to the Grail castle, finally stands before the suffering king a second time, finally opens his mouth and asks the question he should have asked years before, the simplicity of it is almost shocking. There is no incantation, no ritual, no display of martial achievement, no proof of worthiness beyond the act of asking itself. And yet the moment the question is asked, everything changes. The wound closes. The Fisher King rises. The hall fills with light. And outside, slowly, across the breadth of the wasteland, the rain begins to fall. The grass comes back first, in the version of the story I return to most in my mind. Then the rivers fill. Then the animals return to the forests, moving with the careful curiosity of creatures who have been away for a long time and are not yet certain whether it is safe to come back. And the people in the emptied villages come to their doors and look at the sky and feel something on their faces that it takes them a moment to identify, because they have gone so long without it. Warmth, rain, the smell of wet earth, the ordinary miracle of a world that is working again. All of this, all of it, from one asked question, from one moment of genuine, humble, present-tense compassion. The scholars who have mapped the pre-Christian roots of the Grail legend, Jessie Laidley Weston most famously, in her 1920 study From Ritual to Romance, which influenced T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and through that poem shaped an entire century of literary thinking, argue that the Fisher King story descends from very ancient fertility rituals, from ceremonies in which the symbolic death and resurrection of a sacred king was enacted to ensure the continuation of the agricultural cycle, from a time when human beings understood their own fate as inseparable from the fate of the earth beneath them, when the boundary between the human and the natural was thin enough that a king's wound could genuinely, in the minds of those who lived by it, make a difference to the harvest. Whether or not this genealogy is precisely accurate in every detail, the instinct it points toward is real and old and worth taking seriously. The idea that we are not separate from the world we inhabit, that the inner life of a culture, the health of its values, the integrity of its leaders, the quality of attention its members bring to one another's suffering, is not merely a philosophical matter. It is an ecological one. It shapes the actual conditions of life in ways both visible and invisible for everyone within reach of its influence. The Grail legend, at its deepest level, is not a story about finding a sacred object. It is a story about what an entire civilization must become before it is capable of asking the right question. And in our next segment, we will follow that civilization and that question out of the medieval halls where the poets first shaped it, and into the centuries of searchers, scholars, and seekers who took the legend at its word, packed their bags, and went looking. At some point, the legend stopped being enough. This is perhaps inevitable. When a story is told with sufficient conviction, over sufficient centuries, to sufficient numbers of people who find in it something that resonates with the deepest part of themselves. Eventually, someone will put down the book, stand up from the chair and say, "But what if it is real? What if the cup exists somewhere in the physical world, waiting not for a literary hero, but for an actual person with actual boots and an actual willingness to go and find it? And then that person will go." This has been happening in various forms for a very long time. The history of Grail seeking is in many ways a history of human longing made ambulatory, desire that refused to remain seated, that insisted on translating itself into journeys, into excavations, into theories elaborated with such passionate detail that they take on the texture of certainty. Some of these seekers were scholars, some were mystics, some were adventurers with more enthusiasm than evidence, some were all three at once, which is perhaps the most interesting category of all. What they share, across the centuries, is a quality that is difficult to dismiss even when the specific claims they made have not survived scrutiny. They believed that the world contained, somewhere within it, something of extraordinary and transformative power, and they were willing to go and look. The earliest physical searches for the Grail are inseparable from the great pilgrimage culture of medieval Europe. In a world where the veneration of relics was not a superstition but a technology, a practical means of accessing the divine, of bringing the sacred into contact with the ordinary, of healing both body and soul through proximity to the holy, the idea that the cup of the Last Supper might exist somewhere and might be found was not fantastical, it was logical. Pilgrims already traveled to Rome to venerate the supposed bones of Peter and Paul. They walked to Santiago de Compostela across the width of Spain to reach the tomb of James. They crossed to Jerusalem at extraordinary cost and danger to stand in the places where the gospel stories had unfolded. Why would the Grail be different? Why should the cup not be somewhere physical and touchable, waiting for the right pilgrim to arrive? Several objects emerged in the medieval period as candidates. In Valencia, Spain, a vessel of agate, dark reddish-brown, mounted in medieval gold, was declared to be the Holy Chalice as early as the 14th century, and possibly much earlier. It had arrived in Spain via Rome, where it had been kept in the papal treasury and was given to the King of Aragon in 1437, when the papacy, under financial pressure, needed to secure his political support. The Valencia Chalice, the Santo Cáliz, is still displayed in the Cathedral of Valencia today, still venerated, still drawing pilgrims who come to stand before it with the particular quality of attention that people bring to objects they believe carry more than their physical weight. Scholars have examined it carefully. The stone cup at its base has been dated to somewhere between the 4th century BCE and the 1st century CE, which means it is at least the right age. It is the right type of object. It could, within the bounds of archaeological possibility, have been present in 1st century Jerusalem. The Catholic Church has never officially declared it to be the authentic Grail. That level of certainty has always been withheld. But several popes have celebrated Mass with it, and John Paul II, when he visited Valencia in 1982, described it as an object of profound devotion. It is, of all the physical candidates for the Grail, the one that serious scholars are least quick to dismiss entirely. In Genoa, a different object makes a different claim. The Sacro Catino, a wide, shallow dish of green Egyptian glass, hexagonal in shape, its surface the color of a forest seen through fog, was brought to Genoa by the Crusaders after the capture of Caesarea in 1101, and for centuries was believed to be carved from a single enormous emerald, which added to its aura of the miraculous. Medieval pilgrims came to see it in extraordinary numbers. It was famous across Europe as a genuine relic of the highest order. Napoleon, in 1806, had it taken to Paris. It was returned eventually, but damaged, chipped during transport. its mystery diminished by the indignity of breakage. And analysis conducted in the 19th century confirmed what the chip had already begun to suggest. It was not emerald, but glass. Beautifully ancient glass. Genuinely precious in its own right, but glass nonetheless. The Sacrocatino's claim to Grail status faded quietly after that. The way so many legends fade when they're brought into too close contact with the measuring instruments of a later age. But perhaps the most extraordinary flowering of Grail seeking came not in the medieval period at all, but in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A moment when the industrialized world, having dismantled so many of the old certainties, found itself unexpectedly hungry for mystery, for the sense that the universe contained depths that the railway timetable and the factory schedule could not exhaust. Into this hunger, the Grail poured itself like water, finding the shape of its container. Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal, premiering in 1882, brought the Grail story to a new and enormous audience, dressing it in the most overwhelming music of the age, presenting the Grail Knights as a kind of spiritual aristocracy, guardians of a sacred mystery in a world that was losing the capacity for reverence. The opera was so charged with spiritual atmosphere that Wagner declared Bayreuth, where it was performed, a sacred site. He called Parsifal not an opera, but a sacred stage festival play. Audiences wept. Some refused to applaud, feeling that applause was insufficient or inappropriate, as it might be in a church. And around this same period, scholars and mystics and occultists across Europe were drawing the Grail into increasingly elaborate theoretical frameworks. The Rosicrucians had their interpretations, the Theosophists had theirs. The various secret societies of the fin de siècle, which proliferated with the enthusiasm of an age that had lost its conventional faith and was trying to replace it with something more exotic, all found in the Grail a symbol capacious enough to carry whatever they needed it to mean. Then came the theory that would, in the 20th century, prove to be the most culturally explosive of all, and which demonstrates, better than almost any other example, how the Grail's power lies not in any single meaning, but in its extraordinary ability to absorb new ones. In 1982, a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail was published by 3 authors, Michael Begant, Richard Ley, and Henry Lincoln, and argued, with elaborate documentation and an air of conspiracy just barely contained, that the Grail was not a cup at all, that the medieval French word, sangreal, Holy Grail, had been deliberately mistranslated, that it should be parsed not as sangreal, but as sangreal, royal blood, and that the Grail legend was therefore an encoded reference to a bloodline, specifically the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, who had, according to this theory, married and produced children whose descendants had survived in secret in the south of France, protected by a shadowy organization, their existence suppressed by a church that could not afford to allow their existence to be acknowledged. The theory was not, to put it gently, universally embraced by academic historians. The evidence was selective. The connections were drawn with a confidence that the underlying sources did not quite support. And yet the book was a worldwide phenomenon. It remained on bestseller lists for years. It shaped Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which went on to sell 80 million copies and introduce the sangreal theory to an audience of a size that no academic journal could dream of reaching. What this tells us is something interesting and worth sitting with. The theory was not embraced because the evidence was overwhelming. It was embraced because the story it told answered something. It offered a Grail that was not locked in the remote past, not accessible only through faith or mystical experience, but potentially discoverable through investigation, through following clues, through reading between the lines of history, through the satisfying exercise of believing that the official version of events is not the whole story. It offered, in other words, the same thing the medieval Grail always offered, the sense that beneath the visible surface of the world, something of extraordinary importance is hidden, that the right seeker with the right preparation might find it, that the quest is not over. There were those who searched more literally. Niven Sinclair and others spent years investigating Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, that extraordinary 15th century structure with its carved stone interior of almost hallucinatory complexity, its green men and its fallen angels, and its pillars of such refined craftsmanship that legends grew up around them almost immediately. The Sinclair family who built it were connected by some theorists to the Knights Templar, whose dissolution in the early 14th century had produced its own enormous body of legend, including the persistent idea that the Templars had found something beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and carried it westward, hidden it, protected it, perhaps brought it, eventually, to Scotland. Rosslyn has been scanned with ground-penetrating radar. The results were suggestive enough to sustain the speculation and ambiguous enough to resolve nothing, which is, you begin to notice, a pattern. The serious investigations always end this way, not with definitive refutation, which would at least be clean, but with the particular inconclusiveness that keeps the question alive and the search continuing. And perhaps that is not an accident. Perhaps the Grail, whatever it is, wherever it is, has always been most powerful precisely at that threshold between the possible and the unproven, in the space where certainty has not yet arrived and imagination has not yet been foreclosed, in the territory where the seeker is still moving, still asking, still convinced that the next valley, the next archive, the next carefully re-examined text might yield what all the previous ones have not. The search has never ended. It is happening now, in ways both earnest and eccentric, in libraries and in landscapes, in the minds of scholars and in the hearts of people who have never written an academic paper in their lives, but who feel, with a conviction they could not fully explain, that the world contains more than it currently shows. They may be right, and in our final segment we will ask what that might mean, not just for the Grail, but for us. Every great story eventually arrives at a question it cannot answer for you. It can carry you a long way. It can walk with you through the forest, light the hall, show you the procession and the wounded king and the question that heals everything. And then, at a certain point, it stops. It sets down what it has been carrying, and it looks at you quietly, the way old stories do, and it waits to see what you will do with what you have been given. The Holy Grail has been doing this for 800 years. And what is remarkable, what is perhaps the most remarkable thing about this legend, when you step back and regard it in its full span, is that it still works. It still stops people, still reaches something interior and largely undefended in human beings who encounter it, whether they come to it through medieval poetry or Hollywood cinema or a late-night journey through the stranger corners of the internet. It still produces in the reader, the listener, the viewer, that particular quality of longing that has no clean modern name, the sense that the world is almost right, that something just at the edge of perception is asking to be found, that the search is not only worthwhile but in some sense the most worthwhile thing a person could undertake. Why? After everything, after the academic debunkings and the fanciful theories and the novels and the films and the centuries of failed expeditions and the ground-penetrating radar that found nothing conclusive beneath Rosslyn Chapel, why does the Grail still hold? Part of the answer is structural. The Grail legend is built around an absence, and absence in storytelling is one of the most powerful forces available. What is missing exerts a gravitational pull that no present object can quite match. The cup that is never found is more compelling than any cup that could be found, because the found cup immediately becomes a thing with dimensions and weight and the possibility of disappointment. The unfound cup remains luminous, remains possibility, remains whatever each individual seeker needs it to be. This is not a weakness of the legend. It is its deepest architecture. But there is something else too, something that the poets understood. From Chrétien in the 12th century to the writers and filmmakers who have returned to the Grail in every generation since, something that the theologians and the treasure hunters and the conspiracy theorists have, in their different ways, all been circling without quite landing on. The Grail was never really about the object. It was about what the object required of the person seeking it. Percival did not fail at the Grail Castle because he lacked strength or courage or the right bloodline. He failed because he was not yet fully present, not yet paying the quality of attention that another person's suffering deserves, not yet humble enough to let go of what he thought he knew and simply ask. His second visit to the castle, the one that heals everything, requires no new skill, no new weapon, no new knowledge. It requires only that he arrive as a more complete human being than he was before, one who has suffered enough, and learned enough, and been humbled enough to look at another person's pain and respond to it directly. That is the quest. That is what all the riding through dark forests and all the failed attempts and all the long, difficult, uncomfortable years of the journey were for. Not to find the cup, to become the person capable of asking about the cup, to become, in the fullest sense of the word, someone who is actually present in the world, present to its beauty, present to its suffering, present to the extraordinary and ordinary people who move through it alongside us, many of them wounded, many of them waiting, with the patience of the Fisher King, for someone to notice and to ask. We live now in a world that is, in certain ways, strikingly, wasteland-shaped. A world where the noise is extraordinary and the attention is thin, where the capacity to sit with another person's suffering, to resist the urge to fix it immediately, or explain it away or scroll past it, feels increasingly rare and increasingly precious. Where the simple act of asking what ails thee and then waiting quietly for the full answer has become something almost countercultural. The Grail legend looks at this world and recognizes it. The Fisher King would recognize it. The wound that will not heal, the land that waits, the question that goes unasked, because everyone who passes through the hall is too well-mannered, or too busy, or too uncertain of their welcome to simply open their mouth and speak from the heart. And Percival would recognize it too, the Percival of the second visit, the one who has finally learned what the journey was for, who arrives not with a sword or a strategy, but with open hands and an open question, and the willingness to remain in the presence of the answer for as long as the answer takes. There is a version of the Grail story in which, after Percival asks the question, and the Fisher King is healed, and the wasteland begins its slow recovery, Percival is shown the Grail one final time. And what he sees when he looks into it is not a relic, not a treasure, not proof of anything. He sees a light, just light, warm and steady and without an obvious source, the way light sometimes appears in the early morning before the sun has fully cleared the horizon, present before its cause is visible, filling the world softly before the world has quite decided to begin. And he understands, standing there, that this is what he was always looking for. Not the object, but the quality of presence it pointed toward. Not the answer, but the clarity that comes from finally having asked the right question. The cup, if there was ever a cup, was always just a direction, a way of pointing at something the finger itself could never touch. The Holy Grail remains unfound. It remains, in the most important sense, unfindable, because what it represents cannot be excavated or carbon dated or displayed behind museum glass. It lives in the space between one human being and another, in the moment of genuine attention, in the question asked without agenda, in the listening that follows, in the small and radical act of caring about the answer. Every age that has told this story has told it because it needed to, because something in the telling reminded people of what they were capable of, and what the world was capable of becoming if the right questions were finally asked. We are no different. the quest continues. It always has.